Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Theresa May has spent the day visiting Berlin and Paris in a last-minute attempt to get the backing of the two most influential EU leaders for a delay to Brexit. Her talks with the French President Emmanuel Macron started just over an hour ago. Downing Street said the Prime Minister's earlier discussion with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel focused on the UK's request for an extension until June the 30th to avoid a no-deal exit on Friday. Mrs May's whistle-stop tour comes just ahead of the emergency EU summit in Brussels tomorrow, where she'll propose her plan and the other 27 leaders will decide on what the next steps could be. With more, here's our political editor, Laura Kunsberg.
No one could accuse the Prime Minister of not covering the ground. But clocking up the miles isn't the same as convincing your audience. Theresa May landed in Berlin first to plead for more time. But the normal red carpet was rather lonely today. The Prime Minister had to wait for a welcome before the two leaders headed back outside for the usual snaps and smiles. The mission, though, not just to ask for delay, but to give the answer why.
We want to understand what the UK needs this extension for.
There's a real effort to try to bring structure to Brexit. You know, we've had extraordinary division, really.
We still need clarity from the UK side.
Theresa May has arrived in Berlin, where she's hoping to win.
The reason for the delay this time is to give more space for talks to play out at home. Those aren't government ministers on the march up Whitehall.
Morning, we're here to continue our discussions and we're looking forward to hearing what the government has to say. So we're just going to start those discussions now.
But Labour's team invited again for negotiations. If the Prime Minister can't get her Brexit deal through Parliament with Tory votes, they could compromise to get Labour numbers too.
There's not really been any fundamental shift of a change in position in the deal itself, but we're hopeful that progress will be made. We're continuing discussions with the government over the coming days.
Both sides engaged seriously on a number of issues. We're looking for a way forward. As you'd expect, there are a number of areas where we differ, but we are anxious to ensure that we can carry on with this process.
But at least one cabinet minister might still rather the Prime Minister goes back to basics.
And what I think would be fantastic is if Angela Merkel will try to support a proper UK Brexit by agreeing to reopen the withdrawal agreement.
Number 10's official allies in Northern Ireland would like that too, but it's not happening and they seem to be moving further away.
It is rather humiliating that we're having to go and beg so that we can leave. You know, it's nearly 3 years since the nation voted to leave the European Union, and we're now pleading to stay in so that we can deal with matters that should have been dealt with before now.
Easy in hindsight, in any language. The immediate job is hardest here in Paris. The Prime Minister to persuade the reluctant President that pressing pause on Brexit will be worthwhile.
Emmanuel Macron has long been Theresa May's toughest EU customer, so she's here tonight to ask for help. Let Brexit wait. He and other EU leaders are not likely to refuse her, but there's political cost to delay at home, and it might come with strings attached.
Talks tonight just to warm up for the main event in Brussels tomorrow, where the Prime Minister has no doubt learnt on this political journey. Even neighbours can be friends and allies, but also rivals. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Paris.
Well, in a moment we'll be getting more from Laura in Paris, but first let's speak to our Europe editor, Katya Adler, who's in Brussels for us. And Katya, is it any clearer tonight whether the Prime Minister will get her extension and how long it might be?
Well, some things are clearer, but bear in mind, Rita, the Prime Minister only saw 2 EU leaders today, and all 27 EU leaders have a veto on her request for another Brexit extension. Now, as we heard there from Laura, it's very unlikely that any of those leaders are going to say no to her at the Brexit summit tomorrow, but they are still divided over how long an extension should be and the wording of any conditions attached. So right now, as we speak, EU diplomats are trying to work to reach some kind of draft conclusions for the leaders tomorrow. This is the very first draft that has come to light, but a warning on that. As soon as those 27 leaders get into a room together tomorrow here in Brussels, Rita, everything can change. What I am hearing is that EU leaders are warming towards the idea of a longer extension, so lasting up until the end of this year, and that would mean the UK taking part in elections for the European Parliament. Now, there are leaders like Emmanuel Macron of France who say that is a bad idea. So does the EU's chief Brexit negotiator. His warning is, on the one hand, a longer extension takes pressure off MPs to finally come to some kind of Brexit conclusion, and also, as soon as the UK has new members of the European Parliament, the Prime Minister can keep asking for more Brexit extensions as long as they're in office, and that, Rita, is 5 years.
And Laura, all eyes are on the EU leaders at the moment, but the Prime Minister still has all of her problems back here at home.
She does. She has a long line of awkward customers, not just President Macron, who she's with at the moment, who is the most keen of the EU leaders to suggest, in his view, that Britain is not going to profit at leaving the European Union. But even, for example, on the question of delay, more than 100 MPs voted this afternoon to show that they didn't want to countenance any more pauses to Brexit, so there's unhappiness about that. There's also deep unease in the Labour Party and in the Tory Party over the idea of the two main political groups being able to come together around some kind of compromise at some point in the future. There are, of course, plenty of voters looking at all of this and thinking, why is this taking so long and why is this such a mess? And also, of course, businesses around the country who are frustrated, furious, worried about the future with so much uncertainty still hanging in the air. But in the end, Rita, the Prime Minister's calculation has been it's better to go through the pain of asking for a delay than go through what she worries about, the pain of leaving without a deal. Of course, there's controversy about exactly how that would unfold, but Theresa May believes that that is potentially a much, much more dangerous situation than pursuing this agonising political path that might not win her any friends, but in the end she hopes it'll avoid disaster.
Laura Kunzberg in Paris and Katya Adler in Brussels. Thank you both very much.
It isn't quite perhaps Theresa May's last throw of the dice, but there's no doubt a lot hangs on the Prime Minister's visits to Berlin and Paris today. She's been meeting her German and French counterparts to try to drum up last-minute support for an extension to Friday's Brexit deadline. Mrs May is trying to avoid Britain leaving the EU without a deal. But back home, her opponents have been ramping up the pressure. Our political correspondent Paul Brand reports.
Considering these talks are all about timings, you'd hope the Prime Minister would at least coordinate her arrival. Here in Berlin, looking for a delay, Theresa May got one. Having to walk back out with the German Chancellor, who'd missed her entrance.
Hello, good to see you.
She did eventually get the handshake, and her host also grasps the problem. The German leader offering to postpone Brexit till the end of the year, though that too is longer than the Prime Minister could comfortably wait. The French were also showing patience today. President Macron standing by at the Prime Minister's next stop in Paris. He hasn't been so warm about an extension to Brexit, as the EU insisted that at tomorrow's summit they'll want to know what it's for.
This is a matter for the leaders of the European Union tomorrow. This extension has to serve a purpose.
This is supposed to be it, talks between the government and Labour, but they broke up again today without agreement.
There's not really been any fundamental shift of a change in position in the deal itself, but we're hopeful that progress will be made.
As you'd expect, there are a number of areas where we differ, but we are anxious to ensure that we can carry on with this process.
But others question why. The Brexit date, not the only thing the government's pushing further away.
It really is quite painful to watch the Prime Minister at the moment going out to Brussels. It's quite humiliating to watch it, actually. And what we want to see is strong leadership, because we passionately believe in the United Kingdom. We passionately want it to be on the world stage and to realise its capacity and its potential. But instead, we have a Prime Minister who's going out basically to beg the European Union for an extension.
With friends like that, the Prime Minister doesn't need enemies, but she has them.
There is no point granting a temporary extension to kick the can down the road
The EU hear all this and worry about Theresa May's end date. A long extension is risky when MPs are threatening to change their chief negotiator.
We are going to be here in Groundhog Day territory again, again and again, and it is only, in my view, going to be broken when we get a new leader.
Tonight, the EU's recommended member states offer Theresa May up to a year's extension when she sees them again tomorrow. The end date would be flexible, but the aim is that Britain leaves before she does. Paul Brandt, ITV News.
Well, let's cross to our Europe editor, James Mates, who's in Paris tonight. James, does it look like the threat of that French veto is now fading?
Yes, it does look as if that's the way things are moving. Theresa May has just left the Elysee Palace here. She talked to President Macron for a little over an hour. It's too soon yet to have been given any briefing on what was said, but the Elysee Palace did say earlier that President Macron was coming on board with the idea of a long-ish extension. They thought maybe a year was too long, but until the end of the year, certainly a possibility. And that seems to be the way things are moving in Brussels. The President of the Council, Donald Tusk, has written to all the other 27 leaders today saying to avoid a series of short extensions, we want a long one, no more than a year. And in the draft conclusions that we've just seen for that summit, the extension will be only as long as necessary, no longer than, and then they leave the date blank to be filled in by the leaders tomorrow. Now, there would be conditions on this. First and most important, if Britain does not take part in the European elections on May the 23rd, then departure date will be absolutely firm on June the 1st. The other condition is that during the time of any extension, the UK must maintain sincere cooperation in a way that reflects its status as a departing member. That's what's been really worrying President Macron, that Britain could effectively misbehave during the extension, and he may want to toughen that up even further tomorrow.
James Mates in Paris tonight. Thank you.
Now, whilst Theresa May was in Paris and Berlin, back home in the Commons, 97 of her MPs voted against her desire for a Brexit extension, and 80 Tory MPs, including 12 ministers, didn't vote at all. She's asked to postpone departure until June the 30th, but the European Council President has said tonight he doesn't think that gives her time to overcome the deep divisions in Westminster. He wants Europe's leaders to discuss an extension of up to a year when they meet for their emergency summit in Brussels tomorrow. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is with me now. Gary.
Well, that letter you were just quoting from Donald Tusk talks about there being little reason to believe that Theresa May can get a deal in the sort of timescale that she's asking for, so by the end of June, and saying that there's going to be a much longer extension needed. She's very concerned that although the EU27 have been acting very solidly, more solidly than a lot of people expected through the Brexit negotiations, when it comes to this whole business of the extension, the whole room has been a little bit more fluid. And part of the reason she's been in Berlin and Paris is to try and nail down exactly what she can expect tomorrow. We've also had today a bit of a boost to the Labour talks with the government, and a new cast list, people like John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, the Chancellor himself being in the room. But the EU leaders are following events in this country extremely closely. If they thought those talks were going somewhere, and they are very plugged in, they wouldn't be writing a letter like this. The other event that's been going on today, you were talking about MPs voting on the extension. Theresa May is really staring at an extraordinary collapse of party discipline on this issue. That whole business of extending the deadline has no friends really in the Conservative Party. Everybody's doing it, or just about everybody with a heavy heart. Less than a third of the support she got in the House of Commons this afternoon was from Conservative MPs. Tomorrow, she's going to go to Brussels, or watching that vote and everything else that's going on here. And there is, it has to be said, amongst those 27 leaders, little faith that this country knows at all what it is doing on Brexit. And who can really blame them?
In Paris this evening for talks with President Macron, Theresa May has been hurtling around Europe today, trying to make sure the EU gives her a second Brexit delay without too many painful strings attached. Earlier, the Prime Minister quickly worked out on arrival at the German Chancellor's office in Berlin that Angela Merkel wasn't on the doorstep to greet her, and so she walked straight in. Angela Merkel quickly took her outside again so the red carpet photos could happen. Inside, the two discussed what the EU might offer. Sources confirmed it was not what one cabinet minister back home suggested, a rewrite of the withdrawal agreement.
What I think would be fantastic is if Angela Merkel will try to support a proper UK Brexit by agreeing to reopen the withdrawal agreement.
Europe ministers gathering in Luxembourg ahead of the EU summit tomorrow promised there would be an extension of some kind, but patience is wearing thin.
We have been here in the same one just a couple of weeks ago, and we cannot afford, frankly, to be every 2 weeks discussing the same issue without a plan.
We do everything we can do to avoid no deal Brexit.
So no deal on Friday?
Certainly not.
In place of the current deadline for Britain's departure this Friday, Theresa May is asking for a departure date at the end of June, which Brussels believes she asked for, fully expecting the EU to demand a longer delay. With an earlier opt-out possible if Theresa May wins a miracle Commons victory in the next few weeks, otherwise a new deadline for departure at the end of December. There's even been talk of a longer delay to March next year, but France has been leading the opposition to that and focusing on what conditions might be imposed on Britain if it hangs around in the EU into the summer and beyond.
We want to understand what the UK needs this extension for and what is the political surroundings around Theresa May to have this extension. And then comes the question of the conditions of what role want the UK to play during this extension time.
Those conditions are expected to include Britain promising not to obstruct EU business, like budget talks or the appointment of a new Commission president. Some MPs today were warning of exactly that kind of disruption if Britain stays in.
A new Conservative government, led by someone like Boris or Dominic Raab, might well vote down your budget, veto your attempts at greater military integration. If you now try to hold us in against our will, you will be facing perfidious Albion on speed.
Supporters of a second referendum want a long extension, hoping opinion has more time to shift. They unveiled 2 new recruits to the cause today, including former Speaker of the Commons, Betty Boothroyd, and a parliamentary aide who thought his presence here would probably lose him his job.
I am here today because I have come on a journey, and that journey is about to go in a different direction for me from a career perspective, probably already has the last 2 minutes. But
government talks with the Labour leadership were beefed up today with the Shadow Chancellor and the Chancellor amongst the extra faces round the table.
Well, we're going to hear what the government has to say.
Theresa May will hope images like this convince the EU there's a real purpose to the extension. The European Council President this evening sent a note to all EU leaders saying he still sees little reason to believe there will be a breakthrough on Brexit here anytime soon.
Well, I'm joined now by the Prisons Minister, Rory Stewart. Rory Stewart, could we just look at those talks that are still going on? They've really been going on a remarkably long time, a week effectively. Is there any headway whatever between Labour and the Conservatives in these talks?
I think the real question is will. Their actual formal positions are very, very close, as you know. So if the two sides want to make a deal, it's pretty easy to get a deal through.
But do they?
Well, that's the question. And I think the problem is that there's obviously problems that you're aware of, challenges you'll be aware of on our side. On the Labour side, there are probably 80 Labour MPs who've now signalled that they want a second referendum. And there will be many Labour voters who will feel that signing up for a deal will deliver some form of Brexit and they won't remain. So there is a management problem here. But ultimately,
and from a Conservative point of view, a second referendum is out.
From a Conservative point of view, a second referendum is out. But there is a lot of possibility of movement on the political declaration. So if people were up for a Brexit deal of some sort and sensible compromises within that, I think there could be movement. And I think that is quite important because if we are to protect the centre ground of British politics, we have to try to avoid the lurch to extremes. I think the danger, if we can't get a deal through, is that there will be a big push then for a no-deal Brexit.
Well, now, could we just look at what's gone on in the Commons today? I mean, quite unbelievable scenes. We've had 80 Tory MPs not vote at all, 12 of them ministers, and 97 vote against the government, while poor Mrs May was out there in Berlin and in Paris. They're actually voting against what she's asking for, an extension.
Yeah. So this is one of the things that I'm personally anxious about. I believe in the end the reason for our country holding together is that we have a centre ground in politics and that we don't lurch, as many European countries do, towards extremes. The danger, though, in the votes that you saw today is this increasing appetite for a no-deal Brexit. No-deal Brexit which would be unnecessary, which would be damaging, but worse than that.
But which after tonight will be illegal anyway.
Yes, the problem, though, will be that even if it's illegal technically in Parliament, if we can't get a deal through, there will be people who will start trying to campaign, possibly in a leadership contest, to go, for example, into a general election pushing for a no-deal Brexit. So I think people need to be very, very concerned about the dangers of a no-deal Brexit, or indeed, from my point of view, the polarising dangers of running a second referendum. I think a deal has to be the moderate answer here.
But the problem surely now is the Prime Minister's more or less lost all authority in her own party. There's Mr Fox, the Trade Secretary, saying he will resign if there's any further talk of, or even any possible deal over a customs union. I mean, well, how many ministers can you afford to lose if we do have a customs union?
There's no minimising the fact that we are in a very difficult situation. The Prime Minister has taken a big political risk. She's decided to reach out to Labour. That's unpopular with some people in our party. Compromise is unpopular with a lot of people who want no deal. And of course, she's also said that she's not going to lead us into the next election. So she is, I think, genuinely trying to deliver what she sees as a moderate practical solution to avoid what she sees as worse things. But it's a tricky place to be.
But there is a reality tonight, and that is that given the votes and the non-votes of Tories tonight, she's no longer running a Conservative government. She's there thanks to the other parties. This has never happened in history.
Well, it is very, very difficult. And from my point of view, as somebody who thinks the Prime Minister's on the right side of this and supports her very strongly, because I think a no-deal Brexit would be damaging and unnecessary, I'm very worried about that too. I need to try to reach out to Conservative members and Conservative MPs and say, we're going to have to come back here. We can't push for something which would be extremely dangerous. We have to hold the centre ground.
Minister, thank you very much for coming to talk to us in very difficult circumstances.
Thank you.
Could you possibly please just be quiet for a moment? Thank you so much. Well, for more on that draft offer that emerged from the EU, let's go to our Europe editor, Matt Fry, who's in Brussels. Matt.
Not quite as noisy here, John, although a little bit of, babble in the background. So let's talk about this letter, first of all. This letter by Donald Tusk was extraordinarily impassioned, and really what came across is that he has very little faith in any of these sort of cross-party talks between the Tories and Labour coming to fruition, but also whether Theresa May is going to be in a position to actually come good on any deal that there might be. They've lost trust in her, they've lost trust in the British political system, which is why he wants a long delay, and he doesn't want what he calls these kind of rolling extensions. They've really run out of nails to bite in this city. They want this long delay either to the end of the year, possibly the beginning of next year, and if by some miracle we get a deal together, then we can leave whenever we want. But the point in all this, John, is that they hold all the cards. Any one of these 27 meeting here tomorrow, listening to Theresa May making her pitch, can call a veto, which means the whole thing goes away and we leave on Friday night without a deal. And they're going to impose, we think, some pretty strict conditions, almost treating us like some naughty schoolboys. So no meddling in the choice of an EU Commission president, no meddling in the budget. Yes, we have to take part in the EU elections, but we're not going to have much power attached to that. So, if you're talking about a history of humiliation, this is pretty bad, I have to say.
Well, now, is there, Matt, any danger tonight that we might not be granted an extension at all?
John, there's always a danger. Remember, the last time Theresa May was here, the longer she spoke to the 27, the less they actually believed her. She made the case so badly that she lost allies in the room. So there's always that danger, frankly, which is why she went to Paris and to Berlin today to kind of prep the territory for her talks tomorrow. But the other thing, of course, is that there was a rather interesting line in Donald Tusk that are talking about no side needs to be humiliated in this process. They're very conscious, as Gary said earlier, of all the stuff that's being said in London. They're very conscious of the fact that the ERG, or some of them, have been talking about this being another Versailles Treaty. They also know about, Marc Francois' threat of becoming a Trojan horse in the EU, and Jacob Rees-Mogg's tweet last week about being the awkward squad, and so on. They really don't want us to be the awkward squad again, which is why they've set up these conditions. And of course, if anyone is tempted to veto it, maybe because of that. And by the way, just one other very quick thing. Donald Tusk was on the phone to the Italian Prime Minister, Giuseppe Conte, tonight, who, if anyone might veto this process, is definitely in the likely squad. But before I came to Brussels, I spoke to Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister, and I asked him whether he'd been in contact with EU leaders.
Of course, I keep in touch with European leaders, but essentially, despite what the Conservatives keep saying, is Tony Blair trying to undermine our position? No one need undermine their position, frankly. They are doing a brilliant job of doing it themselves. No, all I've been saying to them privately, which is what I've said publicly, is that in the end, there is a process that we can get to that will resolve this sensibly. But when you see all this chaos and confusion, don't become impatient over it, and don't lose heart that we've just, completely lost the plot.
But you can understand why they've lost heart.
Exactly.
And they would have a perfect excuse to veto our extension.
And that's why it's so important that people like me explain to them, no, actually, although it looks like chaos and confusion, and though at one level it is chaos and confusion, out of it can actually come a resolution.
You weren't in favour of the last referendum, the one in 2016.
No.
But you do want to see another referendum?
Yes, because I think having taken the first decision by referendum, now that we have voted to leave, you can't, I think, reverse that decision unless you put it before the people again.
What makes you think that if we had another referendum, and let's say Remain won, that the nation wouldn't be just as divided or more divided than it is right now?
Well, look, if there were an ideal solution, I'd love it, but there isn't one. If the choice is put honestly before people, I think that there would be a much greater understanding of why this has proven so difficult and the magnitude of the decision we're taking.
But it's also about the legitimacy of Westminster. I mean, the process of an erosion of trust in the parliamentary process started under you, arguably. And if we decide, if the country decides to hold another referendum, then many people in this country will say, I'm never going to vote again.
But I think you've got to say to people that's not a rational way to behave. You shouldn't lose trust in Parliament, in what Parliament's been doing these last few months. And one of the tragedies of this situation is this attempt, parts of the media, I'm afraid the Prime Minister from time to time, to mobilise the people against the Parliament. The Parliament has been doing what the Parliament's put there to do. The reason why they're not supporting her deal is they're studying the detail.
What words strike less horror in your mind? The words Prime Minister Boris Johnson or Prime Minister Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, first of all, I vote Labour. I'm a member of the Labour Party.
You are still?
Yes, and he's the leader of the Labour Party. For me, to end up with a hard Brexiteer in charge of the Tory Party would be a disaster for the country, and I hope that doesn't happen. But I don't. By the way, I think it's not the right time to change the Prime Minister. Right now, I don't think it's the right time for a general election. I think we've got to deal with Brexit on its own merits.
There are many people in the City of London or in business here who say, we don't like the idea of Brexit at all, but what really terrifies us is Prime Minister Jeremy Corbyn.
What I say to them is, I understand their concerns, but...
You share their concerns?
Look, I'm not making any secret of the fact I don't agree with the direction of the leadership of the Labour Party and its present leadership, just as they don't agree with me. I mean, it's fine. That's, we can disagree. But that's not the issue for me today. The issue is Brexit. And what I say to people in the business, in the city, is this Brexit question. Look, I know you guys want certainty, and in some ways you would prefer just to do whatever deal there is and get Brexit over and done with. But I'm afraid this is a bigger issue than the concerns of capital or business. This is about the future of this country.
And do you, Tony Blair, feel politically homeless today when you look at the party political landscape?
Obviously, for the Labour leadership, it's moved very far to a left position that I think personally is a form of left conservatism, really. I don't think it meets the challenge of the modern world, particularly what I think is the single biggest challenge of the modern world, which is the forthcoming technological revolution. And the Tory party, as you can see from its grassroots, and I've spoken to a few Tories in the last few weeks, they've got a kind of right-wing Trotskyism coming into the Tory party. I mean, it's you've got a polarisation of British politics in a way that's profoundly unhelpful to its future.
So the obvious question then is, why are you still a member of the Labour Party? Why didn't you join Change UK, the Tigers?
Because
that's your natural home, isn't it?
I've been a member of the Labour Party for over 40 years.
Yeah, but people change their mind.
They do, but it's, I have a deep sense of loyalty to the Labour Party, and, I'm not prepared to give that up.
Thank you very much, Tony Blair.
Whilst Theresa May was asking the EU for a short extension, nearly 100 of her MPs were voting against her doing so. And meanwhile, the European Council President, Donald Tusk, was crafting a letter simultaneously gentle and brutal. Tonight, he wrote to EU leaders asking them to allow Britain flexibility for an even longer delay of up to a year, suggesting there was very little point in another short one. He warned the UK it would have to offer, and here's a phrase, sincere cooperation, and told both sides not to humiliate the other. Then it all got a bit emotional, Tusk urging the parties against being influenced by negative feelings, and he hinted the UK would have the time to rethink its Brexit strategy. Well, at this point, we know when Brexit isn't. We still have no idea what, how or when it is. Nick Watt has been looking at where we stand and joins me now. Just talk about what's happening at home first, Nick.
Yes, absolutely. Look, we knew the Conservative Party was divided, but just let's look at that rebellion you talked about. So tomorrow the EU is going to be floating the idea of an extension to Article 50 lasting no longer than a year. This afternoon, Theresa May whipped her MPs to vote for an extension for a fraction of that time, just to the 30th of June. And look at the numbers. Only 133 of her 313 Conservative MPs supported her. 97 said no. 85 didn't vote, including 4 cabinet ministers. So you can imagine if she comes back with an extension, maybe till December or March, those divisions can only deepen.
And then this letter from Donald Tusk. It was short, but it contained quite a lot there.
That's right. Look, you can only really definitively know what the European Council is going to do when they meet round the table, but there seems to be consensus coming round the Donald Tusk's ideas. And Donald Tusk is both being helpful and unhelpful to Theresa May. Now, if we look at what he says, let's look at where he's being helpful. He talks about having a flexible extension which would last as long as necessary. So that meets Theresa May's call for an escape hatch. If I get my deal through, we can leave. Where is he being unhelpful? He then talks about how the extension should be no longer than a year. Well, Theresa May wants it to end on the 30th of June. And then there's another bit in his letter where he basically puts the UK on notice that it needs to behave well if it's going to stay in the EU, where he said the UK would have to maintain sincere cooperation during this crucial period. Now, what this is that the EU is concerned about disruption from the UK from within. This is a familiar idea that's been around for some time, as I found out today.
We had to break the whole thing up, so we had to get inside. We tried to break it up from the outside, but that wouldn't work. Now that we're inside, we can make a complete pig's breakfast of the whole thing.
There were more innocent thoughts on Theresa May's mind today, as she lobbied the EU's 2 most powerful leaders ahead of tomorrow's summit. Back home, the sentiments from nearly 40 years ago in Yes Prime Minister lived to fight another day.
We will become a Trojan horse within the EU, which would utterly derail all your attempts to pursue a more federal project. A new Conservative government, led by someone like Boris or Dominic Raab, might well vote down your budget, veto your attempts at greater military integration, and generally make it impossible for you to bring about the more federal project in which you so desperately believe.
The stirring rhetoric of the Brexit debate is being clocked by European leaders who fear one major downside to a lengthy extension to Article 50. a Brexiteer Prime Minister wreaking havoc with the EU from within. So they're planning to serve a good behaviour notice on the UK with a warning. Step out of line and we'll review the extension and the future trade talks.
In the last days, we have MPs seen coming out saying, well, if we have to stay in the European Union, we will do our utmost to obstruct the European Union. So I think it's just obvious and fair that the EU 27 will want reassurances that what they want to achieve, because there are also other things going on in Europe that are not Brexit, can be safely delivered.
Political instability in the UK is informing EU thinking.
Well, there's this slight concern that Theresa May won't last very long as Prime Minister, and if she were to be booted out and replaced by someone, say, Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg, they might not behave themselves during this extended Article 50 period and prove quite disruptive when it comes to internal EU business. There is an element of risk on the EU side when it comes to this, but my feeling is that fears that the UK would be disruptive and disrupt other EU endeavours is probably overblown.
In Germany, there was amusement when the warnings issued by Marc Francois were first aired by Jacob Rees-Mogg. The arch-Brexiteer pledged that during an extension he would veto any budget increase, obstruct a putative EU army, and block French plans for further integration.
So some of the reaction from Germany, particularly when they saw Jacob Rees-Mogg's list of things he would stop and he would block, was great. You can help us out. We've been trying to block them for years.
A Europe that is often divided hopes to unite tomorrow around a new Brexit delay. Their decisions may exacerbate deep divisions back in Westminster.
That was Nick Watt. Well, we're joined now by the Conservative MP and former Foreign Office Minister Alistair Burt and Crispin Blunt, who favours no-deal Brexit, also Conservative MP. Nice for you to join us. It does look, Alistair Burt, like the Conservative PM is going to put her name to a long extension of Brexit now that a third of her own MPs don't want. She got, what, 133 MPs in her party voting in favour of it.
Yes.
That goes against the whole Conservative grain, doesn't it?
But she has no choice. The Prime Minister's worked very hard to secure an agreement, which she made on behalf of the British government with 27 other states, which took us out of the EU, planned a way forward. Now, if she'd been able to get agreement to her deal, both within her own party and across the aisle and with the DUP, we wouldn't be where she needs to be today. So that's why she's had to do what she's doing.
And I guess the worry is that this extension, if we get it, looks like an achievement in itself, but of course it isn't. It solves absolutely nothing. It doesn't tell us what the next bit of road looks like or how we get out of intractable problems that haven't been solved for 3 years.
That's correct, but no one's pretending it is. But if we don't get the extension, then we run the risk of no deal, which an even larger number of members of Parliament have made very clear is not the answer for the United Kingdom. So the Prime Minister has to take the opportunity of the extension, come back to colleagues and say, exactly as you have, the extension in itself doesn't solve anything, but it gives us the chance to solve something. And I think the Parliament should really look very hard at that and take that opportunity.
Crispin, you heard this phrase that Tusk used in the letter, sincere cooperation. And we've heard from Marc Francois and his invocation of perfidious Albion, etc. What are you going to? Are you going to be the wrecking ball in Europe? Is that how?
It's in no one's interest, and it's certainly not in the interest of the people we all represent. And that's what's so distressing about this whole exercise. The delay is going to cause considerable economic impact. The uncertainty is stopping investment decisions. People can't get on with the United Kingdom in a new relationship with the European Union. And frankly, the disaster of not facing Parliament with the binary choice of either no deal or her deal, and then Parliament deciding between those two...
Or no Brexit, which she would say is part of
except Parliament, 85% of Parliament was elected in 2017 to deliver the 2016 decision taken by the people. So there is you would now have that problem of Parliament...
You know that is a confusing statistic, and it's a confusing way to look at an election that didn't yield an overall winner, because a lot of the Labour vote went up in Remain seats by people who thought that would be a different kind of Brexit.
What you now have is people dumping on no deal as a possibility, actually not having examined exactly what that entails, or indeed putting any difficulties there would be around no deal, which I don't accept the catastrophisation that's gone on around this, in the proper long-term context of Britain's relationship with the EU.
What do you do?
And this is not about, this is not about next week or next month. This is actually about Britain's relationship with the EU for the decades going ahead. And we're in real danger now of conceding some membership of a customs union, which is actually going to take our trade policy away from us.
You talk about danger of a customs union, and yet you hate catastrophisation of no deal. I wonder what you say to colleagues like Crispin, who cannot get round the fact that you call no deal the worst possible outcome.
There's two things here. Firstly, what takes us forward, and I would still maintain that an agreement which it takes us out and then prepares the ground for many negotiations to come. I'm sure Crispin would agree that the future of the political declaration does not set out in detail exactly what the future will be. There's an opportunity to negotiate that, but without withdrawal agreement we can't get through. But on the no deal itself, I think only last week the Cabinet Secretary, and it's difficult to accuse the Cabinet Secretary of being part of a Project Fear conspiracy, produced a 14-page. Well, if you want to stand that up, Crispin, but let me finish. The 14-page letter, which indicated the sort of problems that the United Kingdom would have, it would make us less safe. There would be companies that needed bailed out. Food prices would go up. There'd be a run on the.
This is where we need an examination of the data.
If Crispin and the ERG do not believe that, and if Theresa May does not remain PM for the whole extension, then you know well that a future Brexiteer Prime Minister could just say, oh, sod it, we're out.
But then maybe this is the opportunity to think, what is in the best interest of the UK? We've got to a stage that none of us wanted to be in. I voted to stay in the EU, but I have voted consistently to trigger Article 50, to vote to leave. And I accept that that is the way that we should go. And I'm disappointed that others have not done the same.
I mean, when
we shouldn't be in this position.
You said it's not in anyone's interest to jeopardise.
Except what I would like is to put this conversation in a long-term perspective.
Well,
this is not about our relations for next week, next month. This is actually about our relationship with the European Union for the
we
decades.
We haven't got a relationship with the European Union at the moment.
41 years
they
since
can't
the last,
be great fans of ours at the moment.
41 years since the last referendum. And in the end, that relationship will be based on the interests of the people of the United Kingdom and the interests of the people of the European Union. Now, I would argue that the withdrawal agreement is not a great place from under which then to negotiate the future relationship with the UK.
You do not get to choose what happens in 50 years' time if you cannot get the next month right. That's the point.
However, I was prepared to vote for on the third time, I voted for the withdrawal agreement because the Prime Minister had taken no deal off the table. And as a consequence of that, because there still isn't a majority for the withdrawal agreement, indeed, if all the ERG had voted for the agreement, it still wouldn't have passed. We're then in a place where we're now in this discussion about actually prejudicing the long-term position of the UK, of getting into the worst of all worlds, of not being in the political institutions, but remaining in some of the main economic institutions of the EU. And that can't be the right place to be.
If we end up fighting, contesting the European elections, what will your colleagues do? Will they vote for Conservatives, or will they vote for a Brexit party or a UKIP party?
I mean, well, it's not only the European elections. Let's remember we've got local elections on the 2nd of May. All the councillors in Reigate and Banstead are up for election. It normally comes around in thirds, but this year they're all up because there have been boundary changes. They're working incredibly hard. They're a great, determined team, and they're going to be strongly affected by what's happening here and the impression people have of it.
What do you mean by that? Do you think that your colleagues in Parliament will vote for UKIP or for the Brexit party or for another party?
I don't know what will happen by the time of the European elections. Obviously, one would hope that this will be done by then.
Can you say, I will be voting Conservative in the European elections?
Yes, I will be voting Conservative in the European elections. Hopefully, the European elections won't happen and I won't have to exercise that vote, and we will have got it done. But the fact that you are asking me that question as a Conservative MP just illustrates the huge scale of difficulty we've got.
Thank you both very much indeed.
I'll be voting Conservative at the local elections and the European elections if we have to have them, but we shouldn't be here. If more of the colleagues had supported you on that vote, perhaps we wouldn't.
No, even if all the people who agree with me, the people who agreed with you, if they had done it,